is your ticket to a world of mystery, nightmares, and the supernatural. Get ready for a journey to the scariest places. But remember, once you open this door, there's no turning back. Ready to explore the secrets in the dark.
It was September of 1984. The cold was slowly making its presence felt, and the villagers were preparing for winter. I woke up early in the morning and let the animals out of the barn. A few days ago, the handle of the axe had broken, so that morning I sat in the courtyard, repairing it. My house was located about 50 meters from an area the villagers called the deserted graveyard. My late parents rested there, and for the past week, I had been hearing strange sounds from that graveyard. Even when repairing the handle of the axe, I was disturbed by the same sounds. However, as usual, I decided to continue my work. About 5 minutes later, the same sounds began to echo more distinctly. This time, it was as if someone was making an urgent call for help. I quickly threw the axe handle aside and ran towards the graveyard. The graveyard was covered with old birch, fir, and oak trees, so it didn't get much light even during daylight. The sound was getting stronger, and I could now clearly hear the words being spoken. I heard echoes of words like, "We came to take, you wouldn't do it." As I proceeded a bit further, I noticed words written in ancient letters resembling Arabic on the trunk of the birch tree next to my parents' grave. Halil, the son of Mehmet Ah, one of the village elders, was someone interested in mysterious matters and a trusted friend of mine. I immediately invited him to my house and told him about the unusual thing I had seen. After some thought, he said, "I don't know what it says, but I know someone who might. Perhaps we can find out." While we were talking, Halil decided to repair the broken handle of the axe. The sun was slowly setting, and evening had arrived. After bidding farewell to Halil, I retired to my home and lay down in bed. Memories of my parents came to mind. I had lost them as a child, and I had never been able to fully learn the cause of their death. My uncle had raised me, but there was something I had heard from the neighbors. My parents had hanged themselves at dawn while I was asleep. When I brought up the topic with my uncle, he either closed the conversation or brushed me off, and eventually he asked me not to inquire further. The incident I experienced today triggered the recall of this dark truth. I spent a sleepless night, waiting for the sunrise. In the early hours of the morning, I opened the barn door and let the animals out. After breakfast, I headed straight to Mehmet Aya's house. Halil noticed me while chopping wood in the yard, dropped the axe, and said, "Welcome, brother," inviting me inside. We chatted. I told him about the nightmare I had last night and asked about the meaning of the Arabic words. Halil said the word meant cursed and reassured me, saying, "You might be affected by yesterday's writing. There's nothing to worry about," which eased my mind a bit. During our conversation, Halil's mother, Aunt Zainab, entered the room. As far as I knew, Zainab Aunt was always silent. She never spoke, and I never asked Halil out of respect. However, Aunt Zainab seemed a bit harsher this time. I hadn't seen even the slightest smile on her face until now, apart from a few smiles. Halil said, "Come on, let's take another look at that writing, brother." I replied, "Sure," and we set out together. As we walked towards the graveyard, I asked with curiosity, "Halil, who is the person you mentioned? Whose descendant is he?" Halil, in a mysterious manner, replied, "I swore not to say anything about the man, Ali. You'll see when he comes, anyway," he said. I decided not to insist further. When we reached the graves, we noticed that the tree branch covering my parents' grave was broken. We quickly lifted the branch, and suddenly Halil started screaming. A black snake had appeared on my mother's grave. Laughing, I said, "Is this what I was afraid of, my brother?" and chased the snake away from my mother's grave with a branch. Halil's face had turned pale. While Halil was sitting in the courtyard, I went inside to make tea. While inside, Halil suddenly shouted the Arabic word we had seen on that tree. I dropped what I was holding and rushed outside. "What happened, my brother?" I asked. Halil turned to me with a puzzled look. "I didn't call you," he said. "You shouted the Arabic word just now, my brother. Anyway, sorry." "I think I'm still under the influence of the dream," I said, but I was sure Halil had shouted. When I brought the teas to the courtyard, Halil had his eyes wide open, staring at me. The sun was slowly setting. Halil said, "If you want, I can stay with you tonight, my brother. You seem quite affected." I said, "Am I a child, my brother? It's just a dream." I bid farewell to Halil. I put the animals in the barn and went inside. I made Turkish coffee, sat on the mat, and began to contemplate the events of the past 2 days. The evening call to prayer was being recited. Coffee hadn't kept me awake, but rather had intensified my drowsiness. I got up from the mat, washed the cup, and then lay down for a while. Suddenly, lightning struck, and the house was illuminated. At the door, I saw my mother and father. Lightning struck again, and this time they were right in front of me. My mother had a black snake in her hand, and neither of them had pupils. My mother was shouting the Arabic word again. She put the black snake on me, and then suddenly, both of them disappeared. Lightning struck again, and on the ceiling of the house, I saw them hanging by their necks. The snake coiled around my neck and began to tighten. Suddenly, I was startled by the sound of the morning call to prayer. The dream from yesterday came to my mind. Once again, I had seen my mother and father hanging themselves. This incident had begun to infuriate me more than scare me. This time, I fell asleep while waiting for the sunrise. I opened my eyes with the crowing of roosters, got up, and washed my face. I opened the door of the barn, and one of the animals was lying on the ground. No matter how hard I tried to get it up, it didn't budge. I went to the courtyard and started having breakfast when suddenly, it screamed and started running outside. I ran to it with loud shouts. Entering the barn and looking at the place where the animal was lying, I saw the black snake we had seen in the grave yesterday. I rushed to the house to get the scythe to cut off the snake's head. When I got back, it was not in its place. Despite searching thoroughly, I couldn't find it. With that fatigue, I went to the courtyard to rest. At that moment, Halil arrived and said that the man we were expecting would come today. I had said he would come in 3 days, I remarked. You can never predict that man. Ali might say, "I'll come in a month," and then show up a week later. We went together to Halil's house and started waiting for the man in the courtyard. Before long, a 15-16-year-old boy arrived and said to Halil, "Brother, Kamal uncle is waiting for you." Halil and the young boy who came to fetch us set out. As we approached the house, about 5 kilometers beyond the village, among the beech trees, we saw a mysteriously dilapidated house standing. I had seen this house a few times before while grazing the animals, but I had never entered it. As we approached the house, the young boy who had called us said, "I can come this far, you guys go ahead," and walked away. Halil continued nonchalantly, and I followed behind him. The house was surrounded by stone walls, and its garden could be entered through an iron gate. When we reached the iron gate, Halil hit the gate strongly and said, "Wait here." A tall man wearing a black turban emerged from behind the gate. I guessed it was Kamal's uncle. The man approached the gate with a slight stumble and welcomed us. He looked at us and gestured to his house, inviting us in. I noticed the Arabic writings on the door, and a strange sense of unease crept over me. The inside of the house was filled with a foul odor, and there were small animal parts everywhere. A peculiar symbol drawn in red paint on the wall caught my attention. Pointing to the brown cushions on the floor, the man said, "Please, have a seat." As we sat down, Halil narrated the events at the graveyard, and I shared the dreams I had experienced in the last 2 days. After listening, the man stared into my eyes for a while. Then he asked for the names of my mother and father. I said Safiye and Suleiman. The man wrote Arabic words on the papers and added another word after asking for my name. He stood up, took the copper bowl standing on the large wooden table and sat back down. Dipping his bowl into the murky water on the bowl, he fetched water and dried his hands with an old cloth. Then he threw the Arabic words he had written on the paper into the water. After reading something for about 15 minutes, he breathed on the bowl and told me, "Drink this water." I hesitated to drink the water, but the man's long efforts made me feel a drinking obligation, and I drank it. After drinking, Uncle Kamal asked me to look into his eyes, and when I looked into his eyes, I felt a sensation of yawning. The mystery of the incident was growing with each passing moment. After yawning several times, Uncle Kamal waited silently, staring into my eyes for a long time. Then, with an annoyed expression, he said, "Let's take a look at that grave." We went outside together and headed towards the cemetery. When we arrived at the village, the sun was about to set. Halil turned to Kamal Uncle, saying, "Stay with us tonight. We'll solve the problem during daylight tomorrow." Kamal Uncle thought for a moment, then turned to me and said, "I heard you live alone. It would be more appropriate for me to be a guest in your house tonight." I didn't want Uncle Kamal to stay in my house, but I felt a great responsibility, so I nodded. Halil went inside, and Kamal Uncle and I set out towards my house. Suddenly, he turned to me, smiled, and said, "There's a great danger upon you, my son. We will save you from this danger." With this sentence, I began to trust Uncle Kamal a bit more. We arrived home, and I prepared a place for Uncle Kamal and brewed tea. Uncle Kamal had been looking at the ceiling since we entered the house, but due to my shyness, I didn't dare to ask. "Strange, very strange," he said. "What's wrong, Uncle Kamal?" I asked. "It doesn't matter. Just serve the tea and let's have some," Uncle Kamal said. After drinking our tea, we started chatting. I explained the events in detail, but Uncle Kamal just listened with a nod. He didn't offer any comforting words about the incident. "I feel sleepy. Is my place ready?" he asked. Despite not liking his tone, I said, "Ready, Uncle. Please come in." I showed him his place, and he lay down. After tidying up around, I also lay down. A voice came from the room where Uncle Kamal was lying inside. It was hard to understand exactly what he was saying. I quickly entered the room. Uncle Kamal was standing with his back turned. Suddenly, he turned to me and smiled, starting to approach me with slow steps. The room had suddenly darkened for some reason. Uncle Kamal was not visible, and I shuddered with a sudden pain in my left arm. When I raised my arm, I saw a black snake coiled around my wrist. For a brief moment, it illuminated as well, and there was no more than a step's distance between Uncle Kamal and me. He had no pupils. He pointed upward, saying, "You're dead, my boy." "Up there," he said. I saw my parents hanging by their necks. Their tongues were hanging out. Their faces were purple, and their eyes were wide open, staring into my eyes. I suddenly jumped. The morning call to prayer was being recited again. I had somewhat accustomed myself to these kinds of dreams. With all my composure, I went to the room where Uncle Kamal was supposed to be, but he was not there. At that moment, I heard a sound from outside and went out. Uncle Kamal was standing in front of the door, watching the garden. I called out to him, and he turned to me, saying, "Stay inside." I didn't understand what was happening. I went inside and waited for Uncle Kamal to come. Soon, he entered. He told me the prayers I needed to recite and went to his room. I did as he instructed and then lay down. I woke up to the sound of the door. Halil had arrived. I got up and opened the door. At that moment, Uncle Kamal also came out of his room, greeted Halil. We had breakfast together in the courtyard. I repeated the things I did every day, and they chatted in the courtyard. Suddenly, Uncle Kamal stood up saying, "It's time. Let's take a look at that grave." We set out together. As we entered the cemetery, I heard Uncle Kamal saying something in Arabic. When he saw the writing on the tree at the head of the graves, he started yawning again, just like he did yesterday. I couldn't make sense of this yawning. I turned to Halil and asked him why this is happening, my brother. Halil put his index finger to his mouth, gesturing for me to stay quiet. Uncle Kamal's yawning had stopped and he turned to me saying, "Why did your mother and father die?" I told them that my parents had died when I was young, that fate had come and taken their lives, and I didn't know more. Uncle Kamal remained silent for a while. Without waiting for him to speak, I asked, "What does it say on that tree, Uncle?" He looked at the tree and said it was written in 1951. At first I couldn't make sense of this number, but then the date of my mother and father's death came to my mind. 1951. I told Uncle Kamal about this date. He continued to look at the tree for a while, then suddenly turned to me and said, "There is a spell on this tree, son. Let's go inside. I'll tell you a few things." In amazement, without asking anything, I walked towards the house. Uncle Kamal and Halil followed, talking quietly behind me. When we reached the house, I saw Halil's mother, Aunt Zainab, standing in front of the stable door, looking at the stable with her back turned. I called out to her, but she continued to stare at the stable without changing her posture. Halil took his mother's arm, brought a towel, seated her on a chair, and asked me to bring her a glass of water. I brought the water. Aunt Zainab drank it, and suddenly stood up, heading towards her house. When Halil asked what his mother was looking at, he said she had been behaving like this for about 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Uncle Kamal looked at Halil sternly and said, "Go to your mother." Halil headed towards his house without understanding what had happened. Kamal uncle entered the house angrily, and I followed him inside. I asked, "What happened, uncle?" Kamal uncle furrowed his brows. "That woman is not good, my son. She's bewitched." I knew Aunt Zainab well. She hadn't harmed me until now, and I even liked her. I was a bit surprised by Kamal uncle's words, but I didn't pay much attention to them. Shortly after our conversation, Halil arrived at the house yelling, and we quickly went outside with Kamal uncle. Halil shouted, "Something happened to my mother. Help!" We ran towards the house, and Kamal uncle was a bit behind due to his leg discomfort. When we reached Aunt Zainab's room, she was lying stretched out on the floor, staring at the ceiling, trembling. Kamal uncle immediately entered and began reading Arabic words aloud. As he read, Aunt Zainab's trembling intensified. Aunt Zainab suddenly stood up, looked into my eyes, and said the same Arabic word again. A few seconds later, she fainted. I was looking at Kamuran uncle and Halil in fear. Aunt Zainab was a woman who never spoke, and now how could she talk? More than her speech, the words she uttered frightened me. I wished all this was just a dream. Kamal uncle shouted at Halil, telling us to leave the house. Together with Halil, we ran to the courtyard. Inside, Kamal uncle was reciting verses loudly, and we heard screams. The screams were coming from Aunt Zainab. Halil couldn't resist and went inside, and I followed him. Aunt Zainab was lying on the floor with blood around her mouth. Kamal uncle, without paying attention to the bloody object in his hand, went out to the courtyard. Halil moved his mother to her room, and I followed Kamal uncle to the courtyard. As Kamal uncle washed his hands, I examined the bloody object he placed on the marble stone in the courtyard. At that moment, Kamal uncle told me not to touch that thing under any circumstances. When I asked what it was, He looked into my eyes and said it was a part of a ruthlessly performed spell. The thing on the marble stone had a flesh-like structure. One side was slightly whitened, while the other side was blackened. When Halil arrived, Kamal uncle explained to him exactly what he had told me. About an hour later, we all entered the room where Aunt Zainab was lying semi-conscious. Kamal uncle recited in Arabic, and Zainab aunt was being comforted by these recitations. Zainab aunt sighed a bit more and said to Kamal uncle, "May Allah bless you." The fact that the woman, who had not spoken for years, spoke because of what Kamal uncle did surprised me even more. Kamal uncle asked Zainab aunt about the reason she stopped speaking. Zainab aunt frowned, and as she looked at me, I couldn't understand the meaning of her gaze. I was getting increasingly frustrated. At that moment, Zainab aunt raised her only arm and pointed at me with her index finger, saying that the reason was a spell cast by her uncle Ibrahim. Halil turned to me and shouted, "What did you do to my mother?" Kamal uncle grabbed Halil by the shoulder and pulled him towards himself. I had no knowledge of what had happened to Zainab aunt. I only remembered that my uncle, when he saw Zainab aunt, bowed his head and didn't look at her face. I left the place with a sad and angry mood, and Kamal uncle followed me. "Go home. I'll learn about the events and come," he said. After what Halil had said, I didn't want to stay much longer. I went home without objecting. A few hours later, Kamal uncle came, looking at me in amazement. "Tell me about your uncle. What was he like? What did he do?" he asked. I mentioned that he was a bit stern and engaged in livestock farming like me. Kamuran uncle fell silent for a while, inspecting the ceiling. Suddenly, he went outside, took the log I used for chopping wood, and placed it in the center of the room. Climbing onto it, he looked at the ceiling. After descending from the log, he moved it to a different position. We were watching him without asking what he was doing. There was a small hole on the ceiling towards the door. He slowly tapped the middle of the small hole with his hand. A round wooden piece entered inside, and enough space was opened in the ceiling for a human hand. He reached in and found an amulet wrapped in a black cloth. I continued to watch him in astonishment without asking what he was doing. He descended from the log and sat on the mat, carefully opening the amulet. After opening the amulet, he took out a cloth from the inner pocket of his robe. As soon as he removed the cloth, a foul smell filled the room. It was the piece of meat. While cutting the meat on the cloth with his knife, another amulet emerged from within. I was becoming increasingly bewildered, and a sense of fear was growing within me. While watching Kamal uncle perform these actions, I was startled by the sound of the door. Halil entered, glaring at me angrily as he stepped inside and sat next to Kamal uncle. I closed the door and joined them, and nobody was speaking. "We need to go to my house. Everything I need is there, and the sooner we get there, the better," Kamal uncle said. We hurriedly set out, and by the time we reached the house, it was dark. Kamal uncle lit a few candles and placed them in the corners of the room. He also took another gas lamp and sat down. Halil and I sat opposite him. He read the writings inside the amulet, then took a length of twine and tied 4 knots. He placed the amulets into the murky water in the copper bowl. Handing me the twine, he said, "Hold the twine over the bowl, repeat what I say, and untie one of the knots each time I bow my head." I did as he instructed. He retrieved the papers from the water and instructed me to drink it. After drinking the water, Kamal uncle said, "We will stay here tonight." Halil said he needed to be with his mother. Kamal uncle nodded and bid farewell to Halil. Halil not even looking at me when leaving the house surprised and saddened me. Exhausted from not understanding the events that had taken place, I followed Kamal uncle to the sleeping area, and he reassured me, saying, "Don't be afraid, you'll sleep well tonight." I lay down and pondered the events of the day. As I drifted off to sleep, I was startled by a scream. When I sat up and rubbed my eyes, a terrifying scene unfolded before me. Kamal uncle, Halil, Zainab aunt, my mother, father, and my uncle Ibrahim were all sitting in a row, kneeling, looking at me and smiling. I quickly got into bed and pulled the blanket over my head. After a few seconds, someone pressed on my shoulders and laid me flat on my back. I couldn't see anything from under the blanket and I couldn't move. I was frozen, as if I woke up with the call to prayer. I felt pain in my shoulder. Kamal uncle had mentioned that I would sleep well today. However, what did the dream I had mean? I waited for Kamal uncle to wake up. He woke up with the sunrise. I went to him and told him about the dream I had seen. Looking at me, she said, "This matter will be resolved today. Don't worry." After breakfast, we set out together. Halil greeted us at the garden gate. I learned that Aunt Zainab wanted to talk to me. As we were about to enter the house, I noticed Aunt Zainab coming to the courtyard. Approaching her, I gave Aunt Zainab a wordless look. She pointed to the chair and said, "Sit." She took a seat opposite me. Then she said the following words: "Your uncle, your mother, and your father cast a spell on me, son." Because of that, I couldn't speak for a long time. Looking at Aunt Zainab in astonishment, after a moment of silence, I asked, "How is that possible?" Aunt Zainab began to narrate her experiences. My father and uncle had found a great treasure in their time. Jealous of my father, my uncle had found a sorcerer from neighboring villages to extract the treasure. The sorcerer claimed that the treasure was owned by jinn, and it could only be extracted through a deal. My father initially did not want to admit it, but my uncle forced him to accept, and they extracted the treasure. My mother and Aunt Zainab were very close friends, and when my father told her about these events, I couldn't help but tell Aunt Zainab. One day, Aunt Zainab saw my uncle on the street and told him that she knew everything, and unless she received a share of the treasure, she would tell the whole village. Although she regretted saying this afterward, it was too late. My uncle did not want to share the treasure with anyone. To be the sole owner of the treasure, he had a spell cast on my mother and father. I was 4 years old at that time. One day, Aunt Zainab came to our house. Upon entering, she saw my mother and father hanging themselves from the ceiling. At that moment, my uncle arrived home and witnessed Aunt Zainab seeing this event. Aunt Zainab ran home and did not tell anyone about what she had seen. My uncle, fearing that Aunt Zainab had witnessed these events, also cast a kind of spell on her. Aunt Zainab's tongue was tied, and my uncle had hidden the gold coins from the treasure in the barn. However, one day, when he went to retrieve them, he couldn't find the gold and began to regret what he had done. Aunt Zainab never forgave my uncle, despite his repeated attempts to seek forgiveness. I was in great astonishment upon hearing this story. Kamal uncle said we needed to look into the barn, and we went there together. We took the animals out and started cleaning the barn. I told Kamorn uncle about the place where I saw the snake, and he asked me to bring a shovel from outside. Taking the shovel, we started digging the spot where I had seen the snake. While digging, Kamal uncle was murmuring something in Arabic. Suddenly, the ground shook, and Aunt Zainab started screaming horribly. Dropping the shovel on the ground, I quickly ran to Aunt Zainab along with Halil. We grabbed her by the arm. Aunt Zainab, in a high-pitched tone, was shouting, "Blood will be shed if you don't give back the gold." Kamal uncle opened his hand and began reciting Arabic verses. With each recitation, the trembling intensified, and blood was flowing from Aunt Zainab's mouth. Over time, the intensity of the shaking began to decrease, and Aunt Zainab regained consciousness. Turning to Kamal uncle, she said, "If you don't hurry, they will come here." And looking at me, she mentioned that they would take my life. I immediately took the shovel in my hand and continued digging rapidly. After a while, the shovel hit a hard surface. We unearthed a large chest from the spot we had dug. Kamal uncle asked for a large piece of cloth, so I quickly went back to the house to get it. Kamal uncle forcefully struck the chest on the ground, causing blood to flow from it. I, Halil, and Aunt Zainab were in great astonishment. Kamal uncle calmly covered the flowing blood with the cloth and indicated that we needed to leave immediately. Once outside, he began reciting verses loudly. About half an hour later, he called us inside and instructed us to lift the cloth. When we lifted the cloth, we saw that the blood had been replaced by gold. Kamal uncle requested a large sack to transport the gold. After finding the sack and filling it with the gold, Kamal uncle asked Aunt Zainab where my father and uncle had found the gold. Aunt Zainab mentioned that they found it in a neighboring village, which had been abandoned years ago. I, Halil, and Kamal uncle took the gold and set out on the road. As we arrived in the village, the darkness of the evening began to set in. Kamal uncle explained that such treasures were usually hidden under beech trees. There was only one beech tree in the village. We went to it immediately and started digging. Kamal uncle was reciting Arabic verses again. We dug until we had a hole deep enough to accommodate the gold. Once the hole was ready, we took the gold out of the sack and placed it inside. The sun had completely set. After burying the gold, we set out on the road. On the way back home, I asked Kamal uncle about the significance of the 1951 inscription on the tree at the graves of my parents. Kamal uncle explained that my parents were subjected to a spell in 1951 and died within the same year. Even in death, the jinn didn't leave them in peace, marking the date on the tree at their graves, he said. I still hadn't fully grasped the meaning of this event. Since we had rid ourselves of these things and I was somewhat relieved, I didn't dwell on it too much. By the time we reached home, it was midnight. Kamal uncle and I went to my house. After Halil went to his own home, I prepared Kamal uncle's bed and I lay down in my own bed. When I woke up in the morning, I noticed that Kamal uncle hadn't gotten up yet. I got up, washed my face, went outside, opened the barn door, and let the animals out. I went back inside, and Kamal uncle was still asleep. I didn't want to wake him up due to fatigue. I brewed tea and prepared breakfast. In the meantime, Halil arrived and said, "How are you, my brother? How have you been since we last met?" In surprise, I replied, "We met just yesterday. What are you talking about, my brother?" Halil looked at me strangely. I thought he was behaving strangely due to the events, and I said, "Come on, let's sit down and have breakfast. Kamur and uncle will wake up soon." Halil looked at me and asked, "Who is Kamal uncle?" At first, I thought he was joking, and I smiled. However, Halil's seriousness made me uneasy. I immediately went inside and looked into the room where Kamal uncle was staying, but I couldn't find anyone. I turned to Halil in the courtyard, looking at him with a puzzled expression, and said, "Kamal uncle was staying here, don't you remember?" The bewilderment on Halil's face sent a shiver down my spine. Halil said, "Are you okay, my brother?" Without answering him, I stared at his face for a moment. Then Halil took out a set of prayer beads from his pocket. "I bought this for you from Istanbul, my brother," he said. With these words, a strange unease crept inside me, as if a cold wind had penetrated my being. I began to recount the mysterious events we had experienced together over the last 3 days. However, Halil denied each one, even claiming not to remember Kamal uncle's name. I wanted to show Halil Kamal uncle's house, and we set out together. When we reached the house among the trees, there was nothing in its place. Suddenly, I fainted and opened my eyes in Kamal's house. Zainab aunt had brought water to calm me down. While drinking the water, I asked, "How are you, aunt?" Halil, with a puzzled expression, was looking at me. After giving me a deep gaze, Zainab aunt silently left the room. I couldn't shake off the shock of the events I had experienced. The inscription on the tree at the graves of my mother and father had also disappeared. I no longer wanted to stay in the village. I sold the animals and moved to Istanbul. However, whenever the events came to my mind, I saw my mother and father hanging as in my dreams.